Hey everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and start on this lecture. This lecture is specifically about the post overturning of Roe v. Wade and what that's going to look like when it comes to abortion rights and reproductive justice or reproductive rights. Well, justice too. But so we're going to get directly into that now with our social problems course. The book was last updated in 2018, so this information is not in there. Rightfully so. It is very recent. However, I have a pretty good feeling that this is something that will probably be in a new update coming fairly quickly. But it's also something that, as we're talking about this particular social issue, we need this understanding, and that's for all of the classes for which this is a topic that we need to be covering. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we are going to get started. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible, but because this is a very important topic, I want to make sure we're thorough and that we really have a good understanding of what is happening. So we talk a little bit about the Texas abortion ban in the first lecture, but I just want to recap some highlights, specifically because it is kind of what triggered the catalyst of, well, not kind of, it is what triggered the catalyst for the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So a little history: in 2013, Texas banned most abortion past 20 weeks. However, in 2021, they went to a fetal heartbeat bill, which essentially is at 6 weeks when there is some semblance of cardiac function or activity, not even function, within a fetus, then you can no longer have an abortion. Now, this is more than likely before a woman even knows that she is pregnant, unless she is adamantly tracking her period and is intending to get pregnant, right? So these are things that if you're a couple weeks late, that happens. It can happen because of stress. It can happen because of illness. It can be, there's a wide variety of reasons for why that might happen, and why in 6 weeks we may not think twice about the fact that our period hasn't happened yet. And as the pandemic went, we really gave Texas this ability to suspend any non-essential abortion service and really laid claim to this particular bill that they wanted to do. And because of that, in 2021, over 1,400 Texans were traveling for abortions per month. So that's a lot of people, and it put some structural concerns onto the abortion carriers in surrounding states, as it was starting to go through the systems and moving upwards in the court case, and moving through the courts. Also, I will say that also was a unique particular ban because it also allowed for the public to essentially out or call attention to or sue individuals based on their knowledge of them having an abortion, whether or not there was proof, and whether or not it impacted them in any capacity. So then we get to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. On June 24th of this past year, 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, stating so the ruling was 6-3, which was the conservative judges versus the more liberal judges. This again took place because of a political atmosphere that allowed for several key changes in the Supreme Court, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the minority or the majority conservative group ended up growing to a 6-3 majority, which allowed for a particular kind of lens or political lens through the court system at the highest level. There was a leaked draft of this particular decision, which was really important because that's never happened, or not in recent history has that ever happened, especially not on something so big. So there was kind of some social warning or social uprising before it actually happened. And essentially, Roe v. Wade protected, and again, this gets into the other lecture as well, but it protected abortion up until the fetus could survive outside of the womb at a federal level, right? So at this juncture, once this decision came down the pipeline, essentially it was not saying that abortion was legal or illegal. It was saying that we're not going to decide this at a federal level anymore. We're going to push it to the states and let the states decide at a state level what and when and who can get an abortion. Concerns about reproductive and sexual privacy as it relates to the Hobbs decision. And so the Hobbs decision is essentially that personal information, medical, it is the keystone for medical, marital, including the same-sex marriage legislation. It is the cornerstone to understanding how we were previously interpreting the law. And it's even interracial marriage. There's several things that relied on that Hobbs decision that said that there are certain things that are personal to us as a human, and we should be allowed to keep those things personal and make those decisions personally with our doctors, with our spouses, with our partners, with our whoever, right? Those who are closest to us, basically. And that those are not something that the government necessarily should have the right to step into and make those decisions for us. And so when that decision came down, it sparked a lot of concern, because essentially what that was saying was that the Hobbs decision doesn't relate to Bosco, you're okay. Doesn't relate to sexual privacy when it comes to reproductive health care for women. And that could mean in the sense of birth control, that could mean in the sense of fertility treatments, et cetera. And we're going to get into that a little more as we go through this lecture. This had an international effect because we are one of globally, one of the most influential countries in the world. This became a cornerstone for a lot of other first world countries, et cetera, to kind of follow suit or to have really conversations about where they wanted to go when it came to these particular rights. It also allowed for a lot of criticism of the US and their policies relating to healthcare and related to women's equality. And we'll kind of get into that. We're going to get into kind of global pictures throughout the course of the semester, and how global perspectives are an even larger societal macro level conversation. But because we're talking about abortion specifically and Roe v. Wade, we're going to talk about that in a more US context for this lecture. A reminder that abortion is a gendered issue. And by that, we mean that it primarily impacts female individuals or those with female sex organs, right? If you do not have a uterus or the ability to carry a child, or even the ability to get pregnant in the first place, this is likely not a topic that directly impacts your personhood. It may impact you in the way of you have a person around you or you've had a loss due to this particular issue or what have you, or know somebody that has been in this situation, but you personally are likely to have not experienced it if you are not capable of conceiving or becoming pregnant. Okay. And so we're going to talk about this in the way of women's rights, just like we did in the last lecture. Only 17 states in the US have expanded or protected rights on abortion. And on one of the, might be this one actually. Yep. So a picture of the bans, we'll get to that one. I will actually go back to it right now. So when you look at this right here, there is an access to a map. And this is ever changing. So it's staying steady and it's staying updated on essentially what states have particular laws and how much access to abortion per state. So it's going to show you essentially, sorry, yawned a little. It's going to show you where your state falls and the states surrounding you on particular abortions. And it's also going to show that there have been 9 states that have a complete ban on abortion, and that's from the get-go. Like, no, nothing. 4 have a ban on abortion at 6 weeks or the last menstrual period. 1 ban abortion at 15 weeks. 1 that bans abortion at 20 weeks. 9 that ban abortion at 22 weeks, which is similar to the federal law. and what it was before. 4, ban abortion at 24 weeks. 16, ban abortion at viability of a fetus. And we're going to get into why that is such an important conversation. And get into that in just a few. And again, when they say viability of fetus, in this particular instance, they're talking about viability outside of the female body, so or the womb itself, like. And then 1, ban abortion in the 3rd trimester. And again, this is going to give you your states. All right, so trigger laws and the state's decision. So as soon as that decision came down and became it essentially was official. 13 states had trigger laws ready to go. What a trigger law is something that's on the books, already been through the state congressional process and in some capacity, and we're ready to either be re-put on to the floor, signed into law, and or voted on very quickly the second that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And most related to some sort of ban based on gestation time, or essentially like the fetal heartbeat, or like the ones we were just talking about a second ago. Others banned it entirely. Some had exceptions for things like rape, life of the mother, or an inviable fetus, say like an ectopic pregnancy, where the pregnancy is being housed inside of the fallopian tube and it is incapable of surviving through the pregnancy because that location is not where you can support a pregnancy. And then others did not make these exceptions, which created, again, medical situations where, okay, so what do we do now? And we'll get into some of those social concerns here in just a minute. Some started immediately, some started in 30 days. That just depended. The 13 states that had these laws on the books were Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. And for the record, I actually grew up in Kentucky. I lived in Missouri as well. I currently reside in Oklahoma, and I have lived in Arkansas and also almost lived in Texas. I apparently am running the gauntlet of these states, and it is something to think about, as I have 2 female-bodied children and I want to think about their access. And because we currently live in Oklahoma, which is the most restrictive of all of the states we have in the United States, it's something that as we move forward, if there are things like lack of being able to obtain birth control, these are things that people are going to have to start thinking about at a very real level, and how that impacts their lives. And women in particular are going to have these conversations and these concerns more often than men. Another 16 states and Washington, D.C. had trigger laws put in place that protected or extended abortion access. So extended being that they made it into a constitutional right for the state, or they made it into, or they maybe added the access for those who don't live in the state to come to the state. They may have added more resources or more funding for these kinds of like reproductive health centers, things of that nature, right? So it's allowing the state to be better prepared, whichever way you went, right? Providers, it also allowed in a lot of these trigger laws that doctors, specifically providers of abortion, could be charged or fined for providing services, even in the event, depending on the law, even in the event of the emergency situations. So, and we're kind of seeing a lot of concern about that too. So the public response. So there was a large amount of public response to this. You saw a lot of it on social media. You saw a lot more conversation. It dominated our media for an extended period of time, and to an extent, it's still a very big conversation in our media, and sparked a lot of polarization. More women and young people became incredibly politically active in the midterms for 2022, and that created a shift in dynamics of the results compared to where they thought they were going to be prior to this announcement of Roe v. Wade being overturned. More husbands or men looked into vasectomies. Things on Google were researched differently, and that was the highest search for that particular medical procedure than in 5 years. So these are really having conversations about how does this impact us at a personal level, and what does this mean for our family planning, for our bodies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Pew Research Center studies from 1995 to 2022 still show remarkable levels of stability in the 60 to 62% of people support abortion access, though it ranges in how much and what particular kinds of things and for how long you can get those. So again, just a recap, in the midterms prior to the decision, they were mostly supposed to favor Republican representatives, and they were supposed to pick up the House and the Senate and multiple seats within both. It turns out that what ended up happening is that the Democratic Party ended up keeping the Senate, and by a very, very slim margin lost the House. So not only did the margins not go as expected, but on top of that, there was a shift in who was voting and why that was happening. And activism led to many shifts moving towards the vote. Again, more women and young people were voting than previously before in midterms, which is important. The midterms didn't go as expected, obviously. And there were 5 states that there's 6 states here, but there were 5 states that put abortion measures on the ballot. Kansas did so in their, but did so in their primary races, not in their ballot for the actual midterms. And all 6 of the states that had any kind of ballot measure about specifically abortions or abortions access, all of them voted to in favor of abortion access as opposed to restricting it. So the majority still, even at the ballot, was saying, hey, no. And the split between those who were voting for, say, Republican candidates that were proponents of some of these policies that were restricting access, there was a split for a good amount of Republicans on these measures and whether or not abortion access should happen, versus the stance that maybe the person that they actually voted for in the midterm. And that's very interesting, right? So it talks about, as a social scientist, we look at that and we're saying, okay, what's happening here? They're still overwhelmingly maybe agreeing with this political perspective, and they're still voting for that person, maybe because they think that's the better candidate, or maybe because they're voting still at party lines. However, when we talk about this specific issue, when it comes to abortion access, they're voting systemically, like at a very well-rounded in some of these very Republican states. They're still voting for access to abortions and to make sure that that stays something that their state has. And so that's something that both the Republican Party and these candidates and lawmakers are going to have to take into account as we move forward. How much of an impact is that going to have on their reelections, on voters in general, if they continue to push these legislations that the majority of people don't support. And so that's something that as a country we're going to have to work out, and that's something that I think social scientists are going to be paying a lot of attention to in the next, say, 4 to 6 years, as we move through several more elections and policies continue to change and possibly get more harsh in some places. All right, so moving forward, we're going to get into this. This is the most important, I think, part of this lecture. The consequences. Research shows that those who need abortions and are denied access are most likely to have to carry to term, because being able to afford and or have the resources, even the car or what have you, to be able to get to these out of state facilities, or the amount of travel that it might take to receive care, is not viable for a good number of people. The Turnaway study, which I have in the linked in the references section, showed that it was more likely for the women to live in poverty, to have less education, worse mental and physical health, rarely put that they rarely put the child up for adoption, and that they were going to do a new study now that Roe was overturned, but that when abortion access was denied, the women overwhelmingly had some negative social consequences of going ahead and giving birth to this child, and that a large portion of them did not put the child up for abortion for a good number of reasons, varying reasons, once they actually gave birth. The most impacts will be felt by marginalized groups, specifically impoverished, sorry for the typo again, women and women of color. So you're going to see a lot of particular communities, particular intersections of class, of race, of disability, of these things are going to meld in ways that create very vulnerable populations to these consequences that were discussed in that Turnaway study. Significant travel for care, an average jump from 36 miles to 274. That is a ginormous jump. That's the difference between being on the road for highway miles, being on the road for a little over half an hour, to being on the road for over 4 hours, like one way. And so that's, people don't necessarily have the ability to do that, to take time off of work, to have that kind of gas money. That's expensive for a lot of people. And so making sure that we understand how much of a jump that is for people to garner access to these kinds of procedures, even in very, like, even in situations where that might be necessary for health or what have you. It also is putting strains on the states that do have abortion access, in the sense that this large amount of states that went into these trigger laws very quickly left the states that did have this as an option scrambling to figure out how they were going to accommodate this large influx of people who needed these services. You also saw an uptick in self-managed abortions through medications or self-harm. They did just recently, I believe, make a law where telehealth at a national level, and any kind of nationally funded healthcare coverage does carry abortion, and in a lot of cases carries out of state abortion costs in those states that do not have it, but also that they cover telehealth and the mailing of abortion medications, and those medications are dependent on them being before a certain amount of time, etc. But there's a lot of self-harm happening as well, because individuals don't either know that those medications are available, and or they don't have the resources to acquire them. There are 32 states that require patients to have some form of counseling before abortion, and requiring various info to be included. So these can be as simple as, before you do this, here are your other options, or before you do this, let's make sure you are mentally capable of making this decision, or let's make you hear the heartbeat, or let's make you go through this traumatic conversation, or let's reiterate several times why you should have this kiddo. There's some, depending on where you are, there can be some very problematic language used and problematic things. So when it comes to fertility and contraceptives, over 500 laws claiming a fertilized egg as a legal human entity are in the works across multiple states. And essentially what this means is that as soon as the egg is fertilized, it becomes a legal human entity. So for things like IVF or in vitro, which is essentially the process by which fertility doctors implant the woman's egg or a woman's egg and male sperm together to try to create medically that fertilization and then implant them into the woman, whether that be a host egg or a donor egg or what have you. And so this process becomes legally tricky now, right? Because would the eggs that don't survive the process be considered killed by the doctor? Would the patient be responsible? What happens if these embryos are used for genetic research? What happens if, say, a fridge in the fertility doctor's clinic goes out and then that makes the fertilized eggs inviable at that point? Like, are they legally responsible for that? And if so, what does that mean? And what it's leaving fertility doctors with are very big questions about their legal liabilities and what services they can or cannot provide for individuals who are actively seeking pregnancy, because that's what fertility clinics are there to do. They're also wondering, there's been several laws that are talking about saving ectopic pregnancies. That's not possible. Okay. Medically, we do not have the ability to detach from those tubes and garner those and then reattach them into the womb successfully. We just don't have the medical advancements necessary for that at this point in our medical journey, especially by the time usually that has been found. So that requires, in order for a woman to live, like they can't survive that pregnancy because that is not a viable pregnancy. What do you do in that particular situation? Is that considered, because that egg has been fertilized, is that considered a legal human entity? And how does then that work? And there's going to be a lot of these cases and a lot of these things that are going to work their way through the courts over the next year or two, even up to 4 years, where we're going to be kind of answering or trying to put place some of these more fine-tuned situations. Like, hey, is an emergency room doctor who has a woman who maybe was pregnant and in a car accident, and they can either save the baby or the mom. Are they supposed to make the decision? Can they make the decision, or do they have to automatically go with the baby? If the baby does not survive the car accident, can they take it out of the mom before she goes septic or what have you? These are so many legal questions about this now that we are at this place that doctors and providers are going to have conversations about. On top of that, contraceptives, or the essentially birth control pills, or things that also manage kids upstairs, that also manage other particular other medical ailments like PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, or manage like really intense cramping when you're on your period, things of that nature, some kinds of pain disorders, some kinds of other hormonal imbalances. These things are used for multiple capacities and not just for eliminating or making sure a woman doesn't get pregnant. Or a person with a uterus does not get pregnant. How do we then have these conversations about those? And are those then allowed, not allowed? What are the legal guides? And there's been multiple reports that several Republican-led states are really looking into laws that are going to ban things like birth control and the use of contraceptives unless a couple is married. So, which is backwards or what have you in my head. But so we'll get into that more. It will also impact sexually transmitted diseases and all sorts of things. There will be a lot of public health concern if that is the case. And I think that will end up being a more telemed kind of healthcare system regarding those particular resources. Because I do think at a federal level, there is just not support for that at all. Even at a state level, I don't think there's a state we have currently that there is a majority support for a lack of abortion. or not a lack of abortion, a lack of contraceptives being allowed. So I think that that would be a really hard sell, but I think it's one that is still coming down the pipeline. So I may be making I will likely in the next year or two be making another update to this lecture, trying to figure out where we stand at that point. So again, if Hobbes falls, so the Hobbes decision is the one that got us to Roe v. Wade, if you remember in the previous lecture. It's the one that got us to there are certain kind of private things about ourselves that we can keep private and that the government does not have the right to know, examine, or regulate. And so some of the things that we need to talk about with Hobbes falls is where does same-sex marriage fall? Where does the 2005 decision that legalized that fall? And there was recently, because again, there's such a majority opinion on this topic at this point, that it would be politically unsound for legislative to push that too terribly much. But there still is, and there was recently congressional legislation. However, it does still limit those with disabilities, those that are not cis, those that are relationships that are not just same sex, that are maybe more varied in their sex or gender discretion. So there, and it also very much there's some choice wording. We can get into that more as we move into the lecture regarding same-sex discrimination and sexuality, and we'll get into that in another lecture because I could go on a tangent for that for too long, and we we need to stay focused. So you also have anti-sodomy laws. You have the right to contraceptive. You have that are linked to Hobbes. You also have interracial marriage that is linked to Hobbes. You have multiple different entities and legal decisions that are based on the foundings of the Hobbes decision. And Clarence Thomas has already specifically said that the Hobbes decision he believes should fall. So there's a lot of things to talk about there, right? So that's going to even impact medical disclosure of medical procedures related to abortion, pregnancy, contraception, and fertility. So that would require government or would allow government access to females' medical records regarding any of those things. It would also allow insurance companies, workplaces, legal institutions, all sorts of things to have access to medical disclosures in private made decisions. And so that can get hinky and then gets to very discriminatory and predatory and scary legal national power over women's bodies and their right to be able to make decisions about their body and family planning. So again, it's not to say this will happen. These are the things that we are looking to the future to really have conversations about. And then again, do women get to make these decisions, or will husbands again get the power to make these decisions for them, as that again was part of decisions made after Hobbes, with Hobbes as part of the basis. Miscarriages. Okay, so, and medical necessity just in general. Do you save the mother? Do miscarriages count as murder, even if they have done nothing wrong? How does one determine fault? Who's liable? Are the women then tried for murder? Could environmental factors that contribute to infertility also be considered liable? So plants that impact water treatments or water treatment centers and or the water table itself, can those, if they create infertility and or create miscarriages, can they then be liable for murder or for the fetuses that did not produce and or the harm to the women's ability to have children? All sorts of things here, right? The Texas law that makes administration of medication to the end of a pregnancy a felony, even in a medical emergency cases, a felony. Are we just going to start rounding up emergency doctors? Because if we start giving emergency doctors felonies for treating medical emergencies as such, then what? Do we have less medical doctors? Do we have people quitting? Do we have strikes? Do we have like there's so much wrapped into this, right? Is there's going to inevitably, and all research points to this, when you make abortion access more more unavailable, more maternal morbidity, or the amount of women who die in childbirth or during the pregnancy process will increase. There will be increases in women dying. And that's a life or death situation, right? So this is something that is incredibly important to really have conversations about, because these are things that impact people in a very real way. The Biden administration created the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which is essentially that basically if an abortion is a patient stabilizing procedure, then the provider is required to do it to save the person, right? So essentially this is saying that, hey, if this comes down to one person or the other, you got to save the mom. If this comes down to this is not a viable pregnancy at this point and keeping this in her, or hey, this is no longer a living entity inside her because of a miscarriage or what have you, you have to take it out or she will be sepsis. This is an incredibly important act that came through the Biden administration to essentially try to, again, deal with some of the social pressures and some of those maternal morbidity rates that we were going to see expand. As soon as, excuse me. So again, abortion rights are now intertwined with pregnancy loss and stigma in very real ways, right? So these are things that as people who have had miscarriages or have lost a late-term pregnancy that they very much probably wanted, can attest to not being able to medical procedures afterwards in order to start that healing process could put damage on their body, not allowing them to have kids at any point, could not allow them life. And these things are going to be wrapped and intertwined in very interesting dynamics. And on top of that, the Texas Attorney General has filed a lawsuit against the EMTLA, which is that Biden administration act. So just so you know, that is already going through the courts as we speak. So far, the Biden administration has been able to keep that. However, once we get into the federal court system, things generally change a little bit. So disability rights. This is our last kind of big point on this. As part of law, pregnancy and pregnancy related medical issues would be protected by both the American Disabilities Act and Title IX. However, that requires a specific level of understanding of why that particular pregnancy is imperative to this disabled person to not go through. And so they would have to do a lot of proving. And again, I think we're going to see a lot of court cases when it comes to these things. And we have a lot of court journeys happening right now and in our future to kind of suss out some of where the heck we are on all of these legal entities. There's still permanent sterilization of children with disabilities happening. And so the disability community has this multi-tiered conversation when it comes to abortion and particularly reproductive rights. So sterilizing children so that they don't go through periods, so their caregivers don't have to worry about hormones changing, don't have to worry about these kinds of things in children with disabilities is already a hot button topic, and it's already something that we're going to talk about a little bit. Excuse me. In our medical health section, I'm going to have you guys um, read a section of a book talking about a particular case about this. But also, you're looking at it getting kind of hinky because a lot of pro choice people have used the example of fetuses that are not developing in the normative way or with disabilities, being able to abort them being something that the parent should have a right to choose. But that also leaves disability rights activists exasperated and explaining and tired of explaining why they have validity and why as persons they have rights to exist, right? So that's incongruent with kind of some of their core ideas. On the flip side of that, um, disabled persons are one of the highest rates of people with violence happening to them. And so not being able to access um, the rights to reproductive health care after violence is something that is very, very prominent on disability rights advocates' minds, especially at that intersection of woman, disabled. Also, I don't know if any of you know of people or know of how um, disability economically works in this country, but it's not pretty. So being able to um, economically have the and socially have the resources around you to fulfill those pregnancies and or the medical complications that they may entail and or the help one might need afterwards in raising a child is there are so many factors to that, right? There are so many conversations that need to be had. And also it's one more way that those with disabilities are lacking the autonomy over their own body, that the government or government functions are getting to maintain control over bodies with this notion of incorrect or this notion of abnormal. And we'll get into that again. We're going to talk about disability in the medical health section because as a disabled person and someone who has a super rare disorder, neurological disorder, it's something that is incredibly important to me. And it's something that, as we have conversations about activism and social issues, gets swept under the rug more than it should. So, again, when disability rights movements are combating with these reproductive rights groups, they tend to lose the fact that there are still pregnant persons with disability being caught up in the middle that want both of these things, right? And that leaves them with how do we travel to get these services? Who's fighting for me? These very succinct experiences that leave specifically pregnant persons with disability in this waylay with essentially no one feeling like they have no one backing them up. And so what a lot of people are starting to realize is that these two groups have a lot more in common than they do working against them, and that language is primarily the barrier, and that those things can have conversations in the same way that well, not in the exact same way, but in the same way that movements have to move through and understand new social circumstances, such as like the feminist movement needing to understand that it's women of color have different experiences than white women, and that middle class white women specifically have different experiences than poor white women or impoverished communities in general. Having these conversations about how we need to be more diverse in our conversations, the disability rights movement and also the reproductive rights movement is going to have to do the same, right? We're going to have to get some intersectionality, and like every movement, most of them get there with a lot of yelling and internal conflicts. And some of them make it through the internal conflicts and some split off. And we will get into that when we talk about some social movements as we move forward too. So again, healthcare and disability, there's already barriers, so many barriers to healthcare access. Um, Man, I needed to proofread these slides. I apologize. But you're going to see a lot of um, issues crop up here when it comes to disability rights and healthcare, especially reproductive rights. Um, as we move forward through, I think, some of these conversations and legal battles. Lastly, there is a references page on there that has the references to a large number of peer-reviewed articles that you can talk to or go through. The ones that I use specifically for this lecture, but I have probably 4 times that that I can give you. Some of them just were very repetitive, and so I used the more shorter ones so that way you guys could that were more concise and to the point, so that we could get through this a little bit faster. So thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you guys for coming to this with using your sociological imagination and trying to step out of our own personal experiences and allow ourselves the space to kind of have a more broad conversation about this. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or just want to chat about it, please do not hesitate to reach out, and we can have all the conversations we can. All right. I hope you guys have a great week and a great first module. If you guys struggle with getting the book or anything else, please reach out and we'll try to get you the resources you need and try to get you to the right person so that we can get you set up for success. All right. Bye, everybody.